Um, Happy New Year, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to another installment of our speaker series. I'm Galina Hale, a co-director of CAFIN, and I would like to thank EC Investments for co-sponsoring this seminar series. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Lisa Cook is an old friend of mine, a mentor, and her here in our series. Dr. Cook is a professor of economics at National University. Her research of topics including economic history, economic growth and development, financial institutions, innovation. In addition to her research, she has been tirelessly working to improve diversity in the economics profession. And currently she serves as a director of the American Economic Association Summer Training Program. Today, she will talk to us about economic and social implications of racial disparities, which is a very timely topic. And in terms of the format, Lisa is going to give a presentation, but feel free to ask questions at any time through Q&A function. I will collect the questions and ask Lisa towards the end. If you have a clarifying question, also put it in the Q&A, and I will interrupt Lisa with that question. Without further ado, Lisa, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Galina. Yes, I am delighted to talk to you about the economic and social implications of racial disparities, although I'm not delighted about them per se. One thing we know is that COVID-19 exposed fissures in the economy and in society. This has to do with health, work and occupations, income and wealth, policing and violence, including the challenge to democracy that we've been witnessing, not just last Wednesday, but outcomes is racial disparities, but I would argue because they appear in so many places that we should actually, rather than say racial disparities, we should say systemic racism. How do we think about the origins, channels, and implications of systemic racism? I think that's the question. There's a lot of literature on this. North's lack of diligence and consistency on Reconstruction. That is Foner. The entrenchment, spread and legalization of racial animus. Let's think, for example, Plessy versus Ferguson and Wilson's segregation of the federal government. The racist development policies that deliberately destroyed Black neighborhoods with highways during the period of urban renewal. Actually, let me go back to Wilson. If you don't know about President Wilson, he segregated the career staff of the federal government. And as you know, his name was taken off the School of Public Affairs at Princeton recently after revisiting his history of segregation. Also, schooling, housing, redlining, car purchases, job callbacks from the literature and economics, these are all familiar to you. Segregation, violence, credit. Even with respect to our recent PPP program, we know that African-American businesses were quite left out because of the traditional history they had with traditional banks and those banks not lending to them. The literature largely has not addressed macro inputs and outcomes like innovation and GDP. What we know is that innovation is a key driver of the economy. You know that Paul Romer won the Nobel Prize in economics for his groundbreaking work on endogenous growth. And he showed very clearly how important the arrival rate of ideas is to an economy for boundless growth. If we think about the current contribution, this is 10% of GDP is intangibles, say the application of R&D, and it is a driver of business investment, which is 20% of GDP. In Koch 2014, the paper I circulated, I showed that threats to the rule of law can undermine innovation, economic activity, and the rise in living standards. Race-related violence in the United States increased significantly between 1870 and 1940. Segregation laws peaked in 1908, 1928, and 1933. Race riots peaked in 1919. Lynchings peaked in 1892 and 1893. These are proxies for the absence of rule of law in estimation. The seminal graph in the paper is this one, and it's the one that motivates this work. If you will take a look at the dark blue line, that represents white patents per million. And if you take a look at the red line, that represents Black patents per million. And the right-hand axis is the one that is appropriate for African Americans, and the one on the left-hand side is the one you would use to measure the line for whites. As you can see, these are orders of magnitude different. However, they're moving in the same direction, and that's what you would expect with a population that is much smaller than another. They're moving in largely the same direction, and that's what you would expect. They're all inventors. These are all US patents. So what we see, though, in this graph is movement towards convergence, in a sense, before 1900, and then in 1900, just this dramatic drop that can't be accounted for due to some statistical change or anything in the data and in the patent office itself. And we see this divergence. We don't see patenting activity going in the same direction for the two groups. So this is the fundamental puzzle. So why is that? They respond to incentives. Inventors famously respond to incentives. They go where innovation is happening. They're typically quite mobile. So this is a big puzzle. What's going on here? So the main findings in the paper that investigated this drop are that violence diminishes innovation and economic activity. And this is with persistent effects. 1899 is still the peak year for patenting per capita for African Americans. Lynchings affect patents of African Americans significantly. Segregation laws hurt the most valuable patents, including electrical patents during this period that I'm looking at. The missing patents are equivalent to those of a medium-sized European country then in that period, 1870 to 1940. So I tried to do a counterfactual exercise and ask what would have happened to invention had the inventors, the other inventors in the data set, been subjected to the same kind of violence, that's lynchings, riots, and segregation laws that African Americans were subjected to. So I took the parameters for the African American series from the African American estimates and applied them to the overall, well, rather to the white sequence. And this is what happens. The true patenting line is the blue line, and the more volatile red line is the one that is the predicted white patenting if subjected to this kind of violence. Now, this has serious implications. One thing that we see in the red line is that it is on average far below that of the blue line. That's the first thing. The second thing we notice is that it's much more volatile. And if we're thinking about business investment, that is 20% of GDP now. If it were 20% of GDP then, a significant part of GDP then, this would have meant that GDP would have been much lower because no one invests when the rate of arrival of ideas is just so volatile. So there would have been a significant effect on GDP had this violence been subjected, had the inventors, other inventors in the data set been subjected to this kind of violence. Well, another question would be, which lynching is the most significant one? It turns out to be the first one. So what I did was to predict the effect of lynchings on expected state patent counts. And there's a significant drop off after the first lynching. And that's the one that you want to prevent. That's what I take away from this predicted effect, that it has a significant effect in their diminishing returns after the first one. So you want to prevent violence at all costs, or abrogation of the rule of law. From Cook and Conchar in 2010, Cook 2019, and Cook and Gerson 2019, we know that there is a lot more to learn about the connection between innovation and GDP and racial and gender disparities. If we look at the three stages of the innovation process, education, training or working in a lab, the actual activity of inventing, and commercialization, we see that at each stage there could be implications for income or wealth inequality. If we think about education, the racial and gender disparities would come through STEM education, whereby those who are working in STEM or getting educated in STEM have much higher salaries, much higher employment opportunities, much greater employment opportunities than those who don't. And then with respect to training, what we find is that using NSF data and survey of earned doctorates data, we find that those who are working in the STEM fields earn less. Women and African Americans, underrepresented minorities, earn less when they're actually engaged in the practice of invention. And then with respect to commercialization, what we know is that only 5% of those receiving venture capital for their firms or their new firms are women. 1% are African American, and 0.2% are African American women. So there are serious disparities, and this is where wealth inequality comes in. In the other two stages, we're really talking about income inequality. We're talking about STEM versus other fields and STEM versus other occupations. But here we're talking about IPOs. 7 of the 10 wealthiest people listed in Forbes have some association with the tech sector. So if that's the case, and this is their wealth is in the multiples of billions of dollars, much greater than the GDP of some countries. And we see that going higher and higher during this pandemic. So this is the stage at which one could see significant divergence with respect to wealth inequality. Just to highlight this, there are racial disparities in entrepreneurship. There are 50 white entrepreneurs for every Black entrepreneur. And what we know is that entrepreneurship is a typical path to the middle class. It is a vaunted part of the American dream and path to the middle class. And it seems to be cut off for many African Americans. As I mentioned, there are racial disparities in founders receiving VC funding. And this is what I was saying about the 7 tech entrepreneurs. And I didn't mention that none was African American in that top 10 list. What are we losing because of missing African Americans? So what I would say is 4.4% of GDP per capita, compared to 2.7% for missing women. This is a calculation that my co-author and I, Yan Yang, came up with, that we're missing 4.4% of GDP per capita. This is consistent with the findings of Shea, Hurst, Jones, and Klenow 2018, where they analyzed the gender and racial distribution for highly skilled occupations in the last 50 years. And they show a change in the occupational distribution since 1960 suggests that there's a substantial pool of innately talented women and African Americans in 1960 not pursuing their comparative advantage. And what they find is that this misallocation of talent affects aggregate productivity in the economy. And this is equivalent to 1/4 of growth in aggregate output from 1960 to 2010. And that's the lower bound. Their estimate is 1/4 to 40% of aggregate output that could be explained by improving the allocation of talent. So this can have this misallocation of talent, whether it's in innovation or throughout the economy more generally, is really serious. This is something that affects all of us. So today is Martin Luther King's birthday. I was asked to give this talk some time ago, and I was grateful and I'm grateful for the opportunity, but I'd like to take advantage of his birthday to ask, what can we do about this? So we know that this is happening, but what can we do about it? So one policy prescription, as you might know, I've been working a bit on policy these days. I would say the first thing is to learn about and address racism, encourage anti-racist behavior, policies, and practices. As you probably know, the American Economic Association Executive Committee came up with a list of books, list of readings for all of us in the economics profession. I would also say that we should learn and abide by the AEA Code of Conduct to make sure that workplaces are places, whether it's in academia or in industry and government, doesn't matter, wherever there are economists or wherever there are people, if we're talking about the entire economy, that kind of behavior is not tolerated. I would suggest reversing Prop 209. Berkeley graduate student Zach Bleemer is showing that it significantly diminished opportunities, mobility for Black students, particularly in tech, and diminished all kinds of labor market outcomes for Black and Hispanic students. And I would suggest in California, adopting Texas-style targets. So some universities have, but the flagship university, the University of California, Berkeley, has not. I would say, of course, we should improve the pipeline. I'm the director of the AEA summer program, so of course I am invested in helping to improve the pipeline, especially in STEM, including exposure to invention. So this is something that Chetty and I agree on with respect to exposure early. For them, it shows that the children who are exposed are subject to better life outcomes, whether it's wages or education. But I certainly am an advocate of early exposure to invention. Enhance mentoring and generally improve workplace climate, including reporting and prosecuting racial and gender harassment and misconduct and addressing racial bias. I think it is a good development that Google now has a union to be able to represent workers in that environment so that some of these issues can be addressed and must be addressed. I would say also that the report on white supremacist groups, the Homeland Security report from 2009 that was suppressed by John Boehner and Rand Paul should be released. I mean, and it has been released, but when it was suppressed and not released in 2009, these groups were growing and they were fomenting hate and they were exporting it abroad. So I think that we've seen the outcome of this, and it wasn't just Wednesday. There's been a lot that suggests that these white supremacist groups are out of control and have infiltrated different institutions. So we have to prosecute hate crimes as the FBI is currently doing, and we have to seek out other fundamental police reforms. I think it's more urgent now than ever. We have to return military equipment to the federal government. I mean, there's been this move to get military equipment to police departments, and that's led to the militarization of police forces. You see, I mean, it's absurd to see tanks, et cetera, in very small towns where they're absolutely not needed. And they create hostilities where they shouldn't. I would suggest that there needs to be a complete restructuring of some police forces. We just saw that the Attorney General of New York has called for this in the city of New York just yesterday. And we have models of this in Camden, New Jersey. They dismantled the police department and homicides are down 50%. We can follow some of the experiments in San Francisco and elsewhere where teams of social workers and mental health workers are on the scene to make sure that there is an appropriate response to, say, a mental health crisis. I think it's just striking how many mental health crises have wound up being deadly, especially for unarmed African Americans. And then a focus on community policing. I think that ever since I've read about policing, which has been a long time, I guess, it seems that community policing seems to be the best long-standing, it's not a panacea, but intervention. So promoting community policing and making sure that police are seen as part of the community, as helpful parts of the community. I think that that's always warranted. In the Bay Area where you all are, sometimes that might be a challenge because of the cost of living in a particular area, so that people might not live in the area that they actually police because of the high cost of housing. So that's an issue for all areas to address. And then there's also congressional legislation from Cook and Concharan. There are two pieces of legislation that have emerged based on my research. The Success Act and the IDEA Act. And the IDEA Act is going to be reintroduced. The Success Act has already been passed. But what they do is to establish a baseline for figuring out who's actually patenting, how do we increase, how does the USPTO intervene, how does the US government support invention and innovation in this country, and certainly, hopefully, entrepreneurship. One can improve opportunities for commercialization through the SBIR and STTR programs. This is a new National Academy of Sciences report that I worked on in 2020 with a number of people that you probably know, including Scott Stern. We can address the racial wealth gap. This is something that I think can't be avoided, as you probably learned from the work that Sandy Dearty and Derek Hamilton are doing in major cities in America, measuring wealth by race and ethnicity. A Black household in Boston, and the Boston area, has $8 in net worth. And I think, if anything, this should absolutely shock all of us. This is criminal. $8 in net worth, that's not equivalent to coffee at Starbucks. And that is supposed to help stabilize people during a pandemic like this, for example. There's no cushion with $8. So I would say that we also have to think about some really big ideas, not just a policy intervention here and a policy intervention there. I gave you some examples, but I think that we really need to think about some big ideas. And I think that what we see is that there are movements of protests that lead to policy, that lead to structural change needed to address systemic issues. Big ideas are needed to bring about change and systemic issues. And policy is born of protest often. The continuation and reinvigoration of the war on poverty, maybe. We need to think about that. And we have to think about fundamental resets, whether we're thinking about baby bonds. I'm not suggesting that that's a panacea, but I think this is getting more attention, for example. And have we seen this before? Have we seen this process of thinking deeply about how to address these systemic issues? I would say yes. And speaking of his birthday, here he is. And next to him is my cousin, Floyd McKissick. And Floyd was a person who was a person of big ideas, and he dreamed of and built an entire city, Soul City, North Carolina, to address the racial, income, wealth, and financial gaps. A lot of people moved to Soul City, North Carolina on the site of a former plantation from urban areas with limited job opportunities and acute environmental racism. They were building their own farms and building their own futures. The anchor industry there was IBM. It became a major component of the plan for job creation. And as I have been talking about innovation, he was talking about innovation being the anchor in the 1960s and the 1970s. There's a podcast on this whole thing if you are interested. And here is just some of the literature from Soul City. And it was meant to be a multiracial, intentionally multiracial community, certainly focused on making sure that African Americans were included in economic development, but it wasn't one that was just Black. It was meant to be multiracial. And this is from the plans in Soul City. This is a water treatment plant. And here is Floyd standing in front of one of the signs. So anyway, I think that there are other big ideas that are being considered, like reparations, job guarantees, baby bonds. But I think blue sky thinking is necessary. And I think this is the moment for that kind of blue sky thinking. I think there's something structural that has been exposed that we all have to think carefully about as economists, as political scientists. We have the skills. We should put those skills to making sure that this democracy works. All relevant ideas must address racism and racial disparities. So thank you, and I look forward to your questions. I'm always on Twitter and look forward to conversation there too. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for the very interesting and inspiring presentation. While people are collecting their thoughts, please post your questions in Q&A. I have a couple of questions for you. One is, it just escaped my mind, obviously. So we talked about how, you started by talking about how violence affects the rate of patents innovation. And maybe if you can talk a little bit more about the mechanisms behind it, because that would speak to what can we do question, right? So is it really just because the violence creates unsafe environment for Black people in the jobs where innovation is part of the job? Or is it more behavioral, that their attention needs to be diverted to protecting their own safety instead of innovating something? So has anybody, or you or anybody, looked into like the mechanism, the behavioral mechanism by which these are linked?
I would say it is both of those. So my cousin Percy Julian is actually in the data set. He was the first African American to head a corporate lab, and the first African American to lead one of those. And his house was firebombed twice. I think there's something special about innovation. You know that invention is included in the Constitution. And what we saw in the 1890s and the 1880s was that inventors who were selling wares themselves, selling directly to the public, started experiencing this rising consumer side discrimination, right? So it was actually this activity, this particular activity that seemed to enrage the consumers who were becoming more and more filled with racial animus. So that's one. The other one, to add a third one to your set, is just segregation. So it's interesting. I find that segregation really affected electrical patents. Well, I can imagine, typically with electricity, you have to have a number of patents and a number of components, and you probably need more trips to the patent attorney and to others with whom you work. Well, that was cut off. So with Plessy versus Ferguson, you couldn't go to see your patent attorney just whenever you wanted, or maybe not at all. You couldn't go to the local library to check to see which patents were just registered, which patents were just granted. You couldn't run into people just randomly to make sure that you understood the kind of invention you were engaged in, what everybody else was engaged in, or get the kind of help you needed to invent. So I think it's the two that you gave, plus it was just pure segregation. And we saw this actually in a number of other places, say in baseball. So baseball was integrated, and then it was segregated, and then it was integrated again, right? I mean, you had the same kind of talent that was mobile and baseball. So I think we see the same in other realms.
Thank you. So we have a question from Mai Hakamoto. Can you speak a little bit more to what exactly happened in the 1890s, 1900s to explain such a sharp drop and no recovery whatsoever in a Black patent activity?
Sure. Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court ruling that established separate but equal, happened in 1896. And what my friends who are constitutional lawyers tell me is that it takes 2 or 3 years for rulemaking, so that different states were experimenting with laws they could put in place. Now, there were already a lot of segregation laws, Jim Crow laws that have proliferated throughout the South. But now they were moving to the North, and that's where innovation was happening. It was happening in the Midwest and Mid-Atlantic states at this juncture, and in New England, for example. And that's where the laws were moving. So this was a real threat. So I think it was largely that discontinuity, really, I think, is due to Plessy versus Ferguson and increasing segregation.
Thank you. So you gave us calculations on kind of a ballpark how much of GDP we lost because of this.
Mm-hmm.
When we discuss diversity and inclusion these days in our practices, we frequently talk about the fact that having more diverse group or team by itself leads to additional ideas, right? So in your calculations, so did you somehow take that into account, or could that be an additional loss, not just because we lost those Black inventors who did not participate because of the segregation and violence,
Mm-hmm.
or could we have lost even more ideas because of the homogeneity of the, teams, would the Silicon Valley be even more inventive if it was more diverse? I guess what's what I'm asking.
Right. No, that's a good question, because the calculation that I gave, 4.4%, is using data from the 1970s forward. So yes, I didn't do that for the period 1870 to 1940, but I think you're right. Yes, what I calculated is a lower bound for so many reasons, right? It's because I was extremely conservative in terms of identifying African-American patentees, for example. I was conservative in a number of different ways, but I would consider this a lower bound. I took that into consideration in the 4.4%. And in fact, in the Cook and Concharan paper, what we find is that mixed gender teams are more productive than single sex male or single sex female teams. So I think that's there's direct evidence of what you're suggesting. And I would say that this is an argument this provides evidence for the argument for diversity and diverse teams straightforwardly. It's not just women. That's the calculation that I was doing, but I think it's broadly applicable.
All right. So I don't see any more questions coming up. Please don't be shy and ask questions on on the papers presented or current policies, or maybe any suggestions you might have for the blue sky policies that maybe we haven't thought about. I have a question on kind of from the international point of view. So, again, going back to the question of violence and innovation. So we know probably, just observationally that a lot of countries with a history of violence or segregation across any kind of ethnic or religious folds, they tend to have lower GDP growth. Mm-hmm. And I'm not talking about the countries who are actively engaged in massive wars. So right. Outside of that, do you know if anybody has looked at how much of that GDP growth gap that those countries have could be explained with the violence and unrest and, ethnic or religious segregation?
Yes. So Abadi and Gardiziabal wrote the seminal paper in the early 2000s about the effect of ETA on GDP in Spain. And those violent attacks led not only to losses related to the stock market, but in real activity. So yes, we do have some studies. And there are also some studies, I think most salient for my work was establishing what the direction of causation was. Was it violence affecting economic growth or economic growth affecting violence? And at the time I was writing the paper, the conventional wisdom was that it was economic growth leading to violence. But what we see in experiments, and Burundi and Rwanda and several different places, is that the direction of causality is in the direction that I posited, which is violence affecting economic growth. So I think, and that's the direction that Abadi and Gardiziabal were also positing. So there is work being done, and I think it's being done both at the micro level, sort of within countries, and at the level of the country itself.
Thank you. So we now have a few questions. So maybe I'll ask them kind of one at a time because they're on different topics. So question from Nirvikar, do you know any initiatives that University of California to partner with Silicon Valley firms to improve pipeline for diversity?
I don't know of any with the University of California. I would leave that question for one of you who might be in that system. But I had Hal Varian out, the former chief economist of Google, out to talk to us, to the AEA summer program, to talk about the pipeline. Silicon Valley is one of the leading employers now of PhD economists. So one thing that African Americans really worry about, and minorities worry about in general, is the use of AI and the way data sets are being, algorithms are being trained. My co-author, Trevon Logan, and I couldn't find our grandfathers in the census when we started working on our Black Names project. So we couldn't find them, and we're sleuths. We kind of are using these data and know them very well, know how to use them very well. We didn't find our grandfathers in it. And I think there's some well-known problems, say, with census data, and they are amplified when they are put into an algorithmic setting. So those concerns were aired, and I'm hoping that there are many more attempts to make sure that that there's more diverse representation. And I think that happening at Google, for example, or at Microsoft. I mean, there have been strikes and protests. Again, that